Most people believe the Gulfs are rich because they found oil. So they are sovereign, they are untouchable and like that. But what if every skyscraper, every oil rig, every dollar flowing through the Gulf states carries a hidden weight not visible in headlines, not discussed in parliaments, and certainly not in glossy reports from Western media? What if their wealth is a chain, their sovereignty a carefully negotiated illusion, and the architects of this quiet control are not armies, not empires in decline, but financial systems precise, patient, and invisible? Today, we trace the path America entered into the Gulf, not with guns, not with treaties, but with numbers, credit, debt, leverage, and promises that would one day shape the Gulfs without firing a single shot. After World War II, the world had changed. Old empires were bleeding from war, economies shattered, influence waning. In the shadows, a new power emerged, not only through military might, but through financial innovation and strategic patience. The United States faced a problem that rarely gets framed as existential. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It needed something else, something real, something unavoidable, and something the world could not function without. Energy solved that problem. Oil was not just priced in dollars, it was anchored to the dollar. And once that happened, oil exporting states did not simply earn revenue. Gulf earned obligations. Because dollars earned from oil could not be treated like local money, the Gulf had to be recycled into U.S. treasuries, recycled into Western banks, recycled into dollar-denominated assets that kept the system liquid. This was never presented as coercion. It was presented as responsibility, modern financial management, and it worked at first. The Gulf accumulated massive reserves. On paper, these states looked untouchable. Their balance sheets grew, their influence expanded, their cities grow fast. But look closer at the structure underneath. Those reserves were not idle war chests. They were integrated assets, tied to interest rates set elsewhere, valued by markets that could turn overnight, dependent on confidence that was not locally controlled. Wealth? Yes. Autonomy? Conditional. The deeper the Gulf integrated into the dollar-based financial system, the more its success depended on stability, far beyond its borders. A rate hike in Washington mattered more than a policy debate in the region. A liquidity crunch in New York could reshape development timelines in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha. Still, the illusion held. Oil revenues were enormous. Sovereign wealth funds expanded. Infrastructure projects multiplied. The Gulf appeared not just stable, but exemplary, a model of modernization without chaos, growth without collapse. And then something interesting happened. Despite having surplus, despite having cash, the Gulf began to borrow. This is where most people misunderstand the story. They assume debt is a symptom of weakness, something imposed on failing states, something that arrives when reserves dry up and desperation sets in. That is not how modern debt works. The Gulf did not borrow because it needed money. It was borrowed because borrowing was presented as optimization. Debt preserved liquidity. Debt kept reserves invested. Debt signaled discipline to markets and rating agencies. Borrowing was framed as sophistication. And the debt was not local. It was dollar-denominated, issued through international markets, priced by external investors, governed by covenants that did not appear political but were binding all the same. This was not reckless. It was praised. Every bond issuance was oversubscribed. Every credit rating reaffirmed confidence. Every megaproject financed through a mix of reserves and leverage that looked, on the surface, perfectly rational. But leverage is not neutral. The moment a state borrows in a currency it does not control, its future becomes sensitive to decisions it does not make. Interest rates become external pressure. Investor sentiment becomes political gravity. Refinancing schedules become strategic constraints. The Gulf was still wealthy, still confident, still expanding. But it had crossed a threshold most people never notice. It had moved from ownership to exposure. Exposure does not feel like loss. It feels like participation. It feels like being inside the system, not under it. And participation is addictive, because the rewards are immediate. Development accelerates. Cities grow faster than population. Ambition scales beyond geography. Every responsible decision, every effort to appear stable, modern, aligned, tightened integration further. Then security entered the equation. Oil wealth alone does not guarantee stability. The region knew this better than anyone. So security partnerships deepened. Arms purchases expanded. Defense agreements multiplied. Again, nothing looked coercive. These were transactions, contracts, procurement decisions justified by regional threats and long-term planning. But modern defense is not a one-time purchase. It is maintenance. It is training. It is software updates. It is a logistical dependency. Weapon systems are not just hardware. They are financial relationships that extend decades into the future, paid for through financing arrangements, insured through Western firms, serviced through supply chains that never localize completely. Security spending became another layer of integration, another recurring flow of capital outward, another reason alignment mattered. The Gulf was not being drained, it was being synchronized. And synchronization is powerful until conditions change. When oil prices are high, exposure hides quietly. When liquidity is abundant, leverage feels invisible. But systems reveal themselves under stress. Every time oil prices dipped, reserves shrank faster than expected. Every time interest rates are high, debt servicing costs quietly expand. Every time global markets tightened, projects paused, not canceled, paused. That pause is important, because a pause does not collapse. It is discipline. The system does not punish immediately. It signals. It narrows timelines. It adjusts expectations. It rewards compliance with patience and penalizes deviation with delay. This is where the trap becomes clear, though rarely acknowledged. The Gulf did not lose control through mismanagement. It did not overspend recklessly. It did not ignore warnings. It did everything right. It was saved. It invested. It diversified. It was borrowed responsibly. And that is precisely what made the structure irreversible. Because by the time diversification plans accelerated, by the time visions of post-oil futures were announced, the funding mechanisms were already locked into the same global circuits. Tourism, technology, finance, logistics, all capital intensive, all market sensitive, all dependent on external confidence. Diversification was sold as escape. In reality, it deepened integration. The harder the Gulf tried to reduce dependence on oil, the more dependent it became on investor sentiment, global growth, and monetary policy beyond its control. This was not sabotage, it was alignment, working exactly as designed. And here is the most uncomfortable truth. At no point was force required. No invasion, no occupation, no seizure. Assets were not taken, they were absorbed. Choices were not removed, they were narrowed. By the time the Gulf appeared fully sovereign and wealthy, it was already operating inside boundaries it did not draw. Because the most effective systems do not break you when you are weak. They bind you when you are strong. And once Gulf binding is complete, the system no longer needs to threaten. It only needs to wait. Because once strength has been fully integrated into a system, time does the rest of the work. What follows does not collapse in the way people expect it. There are no dramatic defaults, no televised panic, no emergency summits broadcast to the world. What happens instead is quieter and far more effective. The first signs appear during moments that seem unrelated, a rate hike announced far away, a tightening cycle is justified as inflation control, a shift in global risk appetite that has nothing on paper to do with the Gulf at all, but effects do not respect borders. Debt that once looked cheap becomes more expensive to service. Not unbearable, just heavier. Heavy enough to slow timelines, heavy enough to force conversations behind closed doors. But reserves are still large. That's the point. The system does not move against states when they are weak. It moves when they still have options, because options are what can be shaped. Projects are reviewed, and budgets are recalibrated. None of this is framed as retreat. It is framed as discipline, long-term thinking, and every adjustment is reasonable on its own. That is how management replaces force. At the same time, security commitments continue uninterrupted. Maintenance contracts renew automatically. Training pipelines stay active. Procurement schedules roll forward. These are not discretionary expenses. They are obligations. They exist outside the cycle of oil prices and fiscal planning. They are locked in by design. Security, once integrated, does not scale down easily. So when financial pressure rises, it does not touch defense first. It touches development. It touches timelines for diversification of the very programs meant to ensure independence. This is the paradox most people never see. The mechanisms designed to protect the future are the first to be constrained by the system that financed them. Still, nothing looks like control. The Gulf states continue to be described as partners, strategic allies, pillars of regional stability. Their leaders attend global forums. Their funds invest across continents. Their influence is visible, but influence is not the same as autonomy. That option quietly disappears once exposure reaches a certain scale. A Gulf state pulling assets from Western markets causes disruption, but it also devalues its own holdings. A pause in alignment triggers market questions. Questions trigger ratings reviews. Reviews affect borrowing costs. Costs ripple through budgets. No one needs to issue a threat. The structure itself responds. This becomes most visible during global crises. When liquidity dries up globally, capital flows back toward the core. Emerging and peripheral markets, no matter how wealthy, feel the pull first. Investment slows, financing tightens. The Gulf experiences this not as punishment, but as correction. Responsible governments adjust, mature economies adapt. Long-term thinkers recalibrate. Language is important because it frames constraint as virtue. At this stage, diversification plans do not stop. They are refined, made more realistic. Projects that depend heavily on foreign capital are slowed. Projects that align closely with global investor sentiment are favored. Domestic priorities adjust to external comfort. This is not imposed, it is internalized. The system works best when control no longer feels external. And then there are moments rare, revealing when alignment is tested, a geopolitical disagreement, a signal of strategic independence that moves too fast, The response is never overt. Instead, financing terms harden slightly. Insurance premiums rise. Approvals take longer. Deals stall without explanation. Nothing illegal, nothing explicit, just friction. Friction is how modern power communicates. This is where many people expect collapse. They wait for a breaking point, a dramatic failure that confirms the system was exploitative all along. But collapse is inefficient. Creditors do not want ruin. Ruin creates unpredictability. What the system prefers is stability managed, aligned, dependable stability. The Gulf is not meant to fall. It is meant to function, to keep producing, to keep recycling, to keep anchoring energy markets, to keep absorbing capital flows in both directions. Collapse would disrupt that. So instead of collapse, there is containment. Containment of options and timelines. From the outside, the Gulf looks unchanged. Wealth remains. Cities continue to grow. Influence persists. But inside the structure, decision-making becomes increasingly conservative, not cautious. This is when the final illusion breaks, because the narrative has always been that wealth buys freedom, that reserves equal leverage, that surplus grants immunity. But surplus inside a system does not grant exit power. It grants responsibility to maintain the system that makes the surplus usable. At this point, even attempts to reduce exposure must pass through the same architecture. Selling dollar assets requires buyers. Buyers set prices. Prices move markets. Markets respond. Shifting trade currencies requires trust, liquidity, and scale, all of which take decades to build and risk destabilizing existing flows in the meantime. Every deviation creates risk, and risk in a highly integrated system is discouraged. This is where prosecutor language becomes unavoidable, not to accuse individuals, but to expose the paradox. Not because the Gulf was careless, not because it was naive, but because it was rational inside a system designed to reward rational behavior until rationality itself becomes the trap. The Gulf did not surrender sovereignty, it optimized it away. And now the most important point. None of this required secrecy. The contracts were public. The bonds were disclosed. The partnerships were celebrated. There was no deception in the narrow sense, only framing. Debt was framed as sophistication, integration as modernization, alignment as stability, and all of it was true locally, but globally, the effect was cumulative. The Gulf became indispensable, and therefore unmovable. This is where the story leaves the region and turns outward, because nothing about this pattern is unique. Resource-rich states, surplus-heavy economies, systems that believe wealth alone grants insulation. They all encounter the same architecture eventually, not immediately, but patiently. And when the pressure arrives, it never announces itself as control. It announces itself as a necessity, necessary adjustments and discipline. This is how empires now shape outcomes, not by conquering territory, but by structuring incentives so that deviation feels irresponsible. The Gulf story is not one of failure. It is one of success defined by the system that absorbed it. And that is why it matters. Because the same mechanisms are active elsewhere. Because the same language is being used again. Because the same assurances are being repeated. Empires do not fall when soldiers arrive. They fall when options disappear, and no one notices until choice has already been priced out. The Gulf was not conquered. It was shaped. And shaping is far more durable than force. Because force creates resistance. Systems create compliance. And once compliance feels like responsibility, repetition becomes inevitable. Not as a tragedy, not as a drama, but as management. Quiet, rational, and final.